Welcome to episode 152 of the World Builders Annual. Today's episode, what to put in your player's guide.
Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builders Annual. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build.
Welcome back. As always, I'm Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And I am Michael Miller.
Oh, yeah. The overly enthusiastic Michael Miller.
Well, you know, if I'm overly enthusiastic, you yell at me. If I'm under-enthusiastic, you yell at me. There's really no good way for me to enter the show. You're going to break my stones either way, so...
We're going to have a rough start, I believe.
I was feeling stoic, Jeff. Can I be stoic now and then? Do I always have to be the life of the party to cover you, dullard?
Well, I was just hoping you'd stop playing Destiny for 5 minutes while we're recording. I mean...
No one knew that I was doing that but you.
All right. So today we're going to take a look at player guides. I actually saw this up on Facebook. One of my friends was posting a player guide for a Ravenloft campaign he's running. And was just asking if it was appropriate stuff. So I thought that's a question I actually hear a lot from like hardcore game masters who really like to prep their players. So when they step into the world, they actually know some of the things that the character should know.
Because as a world builder, if you are creating a perfectly original world, then your players are not going to know it.
Or even partially original, sort of like, oh, I didn't tell you that if you touch door handles that people will kill you for defaming their god?
I didn't mention that chairs had exploding bottoms? Oh, yes, no one sits in chairs in my room.
Oh, new character again.
So why do you guys have chairs? Decorative? Purely regal decoration.
To call out the suckers.
You know what? It took me 40 minutes to make this character, right? Yes. Something you and Jim would do.
Yeah. So I thought this is something that could also be beneficial if you're a writer and you put stuff about your world out there. Some of the things that fantasy geeks in particular, and I'm sure science fiction and all forms of geeks sort of like to know the inside skivvy, some of the stuff that doesn't even necessarily make it into the work. And it's a good way for you to share some of that stuff without feeling like you need 7 chapters at the beginning of your book to describe the food and dress of a culture.
Yeah, I think this is one of those things where it's like, it's not necessarily obvious. It's not like, this is obvious. It would be obvious to the characters that your players will be playing. Like, this is basic stuff that you as a person know about, the area you live in, the people that surround you, it's all that stuff. But when you're creating the world or when you're introducing it to players, there's details you might forget that are pretty basic stuff. So that's kind of what a lot of this, I'm calling it a primer. I like that word.
And yeah, it's like a primer.
Pre-game player primer.
You could call
GM 2-player primer.
Sure. This kind of reminds me of a story from my friend Dave was playing in one of my games, and they went to this area that was sort of primitive, and he knew that the pools of water were very sacred holy sites, and that you can't defame them. And his character knew this, but he actually still died because his character was obsessively cleanly. And so he couldn't fight
that.
Yeah, he failed his role and walked right into the water and started washing off until they came in. And for sake of explicit, which I'll probably hit when I start cussing later anyway, I won't say exactly what they do to cleanse the pool, but it's not something that you want to have happen to you.
Cleanse the pool or they must do something to the person.
Well, they do something to the person to cleanse the filth that they brought into the pool. So they're cleansing the pool, but they use the person to do that.
Oh, I see. I got you.
Yeah. And one great thing you can fall back to in ancient Bronze Age and Stone Age religions is there's one common fluid that gets used for that, and it's not one that you want to share.
blood is my
Correct.
guess. There you go. I was going to say, like, the one, I forget which movie it was at, but I imagine they probably did this because a lot of those movies are not terribly original. I don't know if they just were punishing people or if they were just killing people, but they put somebody and they basically cooked them. And they put them in this, like, bronze statue that it was just ornamental, but they just put a person inside of it and moved it over a fire. So it just slowly cooked the person.
I believe actually,
and I cannot imagine how horrible of a way to go that would be.
I believe what they did to him, being of the old religion, was they garroted him in the pool and then let his blood out to cleanse the water because, you know, blood's a good cleansing agent.
That's it. Absolutely. Sure.
So, yeah.
So getting back to
well, that kind of leads us right into our first point here.
It does. But what I was gonna preface a little more and just say that obviously this is kind of targeted towards our GMs and our tabletop role players. But certainly this is stuff that might be. I think you could actually use this in the exact opposite, like you were mentioning a moment ago, as far as your books go. You don't necessarily have to drop all of this in the beginning of the book to bore the heck out of the reader. This is all stuff that they can get from inference and from the character's interaction with your world and so on and so forth. Yeah,
beginning next year, I'm going to be putting together a closed site. So for people who want spoilers or want to learn more about the world, they can go there. I'm going to start putting up cultures and races.
What about your world?
From my world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll be starting with the Bedrachum. We'll come up first, and I will share some stuff. There's one thing that you could add in here as a bonus, language. If you go into that level, I require all my players to learn the languages of their characters. Yeah.
No, you've never done that to me.
No, but you know, as a geek, I do put my notes into the actual script if the players aren't literate. If the players are literate, they will get a version. Okay, so one of the things that you can actually put together is a language, and one of the ways I use a language as a game master is if my players are illiterate, I will give them notes that they find. I'll give them notes with the actual language written down that they're looking at, so it makes no sense to them. If they're literate, they can get a version of it that's in a language they can actually read. And so
I love that. I love stuff like that when GMs go to that.
Yeah,
detail, and a lot of GMs will, but a lot of GMs won't.
Yeah, and it doesn't really hurt either way because you can easily just say, "Oh, you can't read that," and hold off until they can find someone who can translate it for them. But it's something I like. I like languages because languages give you a true insight to how people think, and what people think are what they see. So it's harder to share that in a player's guide. You can, but it's an optional thing that isn't going to be really listed. But in the stuff I share out in Garduel.com coming up this year for my world, where languages are done, there will be some summary types of stuff about languages. For the cultures where I've completed them or enough to share. So now the first thing I really like to get into is important features and beliefs. And this is like the really top end stuff, the stuff that essentially everyone knows and is like the high end, like for that culture where you couldn't go into the pool, unless you went through a ceremony because you would desecrate the pool. And then they would have to cleanse the pool with you. That's one of the types of beliefs that you want to share here. Important features, whether they're in the night sky, features of geography, really the most important stuff that the players can't miss. And that's the sum up for the players who want just enough to get going.
Right. But what I was actually going to say is, like with the pool thing, if they weren't part of that culture, then they wouldn't necessarily know.
Oh, they would definitely not know unless they found out first. So be careful where you go swimming in Garduel. The next thing is one of Jeff's favorites. It's history. It usually starts with a timeline, and it gets a bit more detailed as it approaches the time the players are in. And it's much less detailed the further away you get, and it doesn't typically go past that. And then it'll give a history, once again, very, very vague. If you want to add on and put some verbiage behind it, you can sort of write out a bit more detailed history to go along with that to give an idea of what happened in those events, if you want to as well.
If you were going to create, say, you didn't have a super fleshed out world, you're just getting started, and let's say like you're maybe going to modify or go with some sort of like D&D or some sort of established world that you could play with, how far back would you think would be appropriate to go to start a story like a D&D campaign? Like, what do you think how far back would you go? Well, that's kind of a loaded question because I know you'd go back about a millennia.
I mean, for me in my world, I start with the recorded history of the area.
I start with the Big Bang, and I just go from there. It's important that players have some detailed background.
Like I said, I'll start with the recorded known history for the people who live in the area, which probably won't go back to the beginning of the cultures, but it could, depending on how far back you're actually playing too. So
I feel like for a lot of this, I want to interject and just talk about gaming. So I think I'm going to do that for a lot of this, if that's all right with you.
But when it comes to using like a preset world like Dungeons and Dragons, you pretty much just use what they give you, because if you start changing time period and stuff within those games, you're probably going to put a lot of work into it for not much return. So if I'm going to use a pre-generated setting, which I wouldn't because I have my own, I would just kind of stick with their existing history. But if that's a preference thing. Sometimes people like to modify stuff as well. So, and I've done that in the past. But what you share with the players is essentially what the players should know from the game that they're playing. Otherwise, if it's your own world, you have to be a bit more specific. But it's really, the key is the parameter of all of this is what should the player know in the time that they're living, and if they've been an oral tradition for 8,000 years and they don't have a good way of transmitting history, it won't go back that far. If they have a long written history, like I said, it'll be the major stuff that's remembered, but like, it's like going to a history book. If you read stuff about the antiquity, the timelines have a lot less items on them. If you get into the early industrial age, there's a lot more stuff that could go onto timelines. So it's sort of what's relevant to the character, how big the setting is that you're planning to play in. And if it's a larger culture, you have a bit more of an area to cover. But if it's a very small defined campaign, you can keep it really focused to the area that they're in too. The next one I usually go into is cultural breakdown, where I'll talk about the cultural norms. I'll talk about what the ideal characters are. What are the cultural traits that make someone, an ideal American, or an ideal British person or Scotsman. America. An ideal Bedracum. Those are going to vary from culture to culture, even if they're similar.
The correct is Bedraconite.
Bedracum.
Bedraconite.
No.
Bedraconite.
I'm sorry. Have you ever created the language? No.
Bedraconite.
And then there's also usually sort of where I like to track to where the culture actually exists. So the cultural ideals, not really where the culture is at. So that, and these are all aggregate things. No individual should fall exactly on those lines unless they just happen to be Joe Normal. Most people are not Joe Normal. The next thing I like to talk about is important factions. And so once again, if you're talking about like a country, you might cover some of the major ones in the country, major political factions, religious factions, social factions. But as you get closer to the area that the players are from, you're going to give a bit more detailed area or a bit more detailed information. I like players to start in the same towns because of this, so I can give pretty comprehensive information to them. Where if you let them start from anywhere in the world they want to, and they all happen to meet in the first adventure and take off, you can do that, but it just creates a lot more work for you. And especially if you're like me, you're trying to translate it online, it makes it a real pain.
What do you mean translate it online?
Well, it's like I have all of these notes from all over the place, but I don't have them in my computer, in my
Oh, I
website.
see.
Yeah. So it's like, since I can't make it all appear at once and I can't afford to force someone to do it exactly the way I want it to without explaining it, then I guess I have to do it myself. And then on top of that too, I like to go into common traits. And what that means is going to vary game to game, but that will talk about, like, do they prefer strength or health? If there's advantages and disadvantages in the game that are common in the area, that would go in here as well too. But that's where some of the game mechanic stuff starts to filter into the game. But usually when I give my player guides, I try to keep the rules separated out as much as possible in case you want to ever switch games or something like that. If you embed it too much into the language, of the guide, instead of like having sort of notes at the end of the guide, it's going to cause you a lot of work. Maybe you have an appendice at the end for GURPS and for D&D and D20, or Pathfinder, whatever games that you play in. It might be tough to actually play certain things in different games because of balancing rules and stuff. But as the game master, you get to work all that stuff out. It's wonderful. That's why I only play GURPS. I would need
That's a lie. You don't only play GURPS. I would say it's primarily, but we didn't play like Vampire and Mage and all that jazz in the GURPS system.
I've actually played. I've played Mage in GURPS system.
Mm.
Yeah, it's not the same. It works better in the storyteller system. It's designed for that world. It's kind of hard to break it. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about the racial breakdowns, which in my world isn't super important. It's, to me, a culture is sort of the prime feature of any area. Races who live in that area will be maybe they'll be adjusted around that culture. So it might affect your attributes. It might affect the skills, advantages, and disadvantages a character might start off with. But as for personality, if they're from that area and they're of a different race, they become acculturized to each other. So an orc doesn't always have the personality of an orc. If they've been in a different land for 5 generations, they probably are more like the people there than the people who they came from 7 generations ago. So
when you say cultural breakdown, as far as a player guide is concerned, it's not necessarily exactly how all of the races work. It's what the player's going to know about that race given where they grew up.
The racial breakdown is really sort of like, what do the races look like? What are the effects to the starting character based off of the race they choose? And like in GURPS, what is the point cost of the race to play? But if they're from the area, they're going to have an approximation of the same cultural breakdown as the humans in the area if their families lived there for a long time. Now, there might be a subculture for that race, in which case it could vary off of the norm, the cultural norm, but it'll still be a variant of the culture in the area. Because after a while, that's what defines you, is where you live, the people around you. And now some cultures do hold on very tightly to what they were, even in the face of conquest, even in the face of mass migrations. But usually after 2 generations, immigrants will start to act more like the culture they're from. The culture will shift a little bit. The immigrants will shift a little bit, and they might have a subcultural norm, but it's still based off the same culture. So for me, it's more of a system breakdown. Is what a race is to me. The next thing I like to go into is the geography of the area. And once again, the closer you get to where the game is going to be, the more information you have to give about the geography. If you're doing this like on a website to just talk about your world, you have to explain the entire cultural geography of the area you're in. But this will be sort of weather patterns. Is it in a monsoon area? Is it in a temperate zone? What's the weather like? These are all things that you use to build the culture, but you want to give a breakdown to the characters too. So when they start that game in December, they have the proper swimwear on because they live in someplace like Australia.
I feel like there's been games that I've played where And it certainly was popular in the group system, where the game master would be particular about making the player pay for knowledges that I felt should have been, a gimme. Like knowledge of like, okay, well, I grew up in this city. Like, okay, well, you got knowledge of the city. We're like, yeah, but don't you think I know some of the surrounding area pretty well too? No. As soon as you get outside the city, you got to roll off your intelligence instead of just. It's like, dude, he's lived there for 30 years. He would know a thing or two about the surrounding area. Nope.
For me as a game master, it depends on the tech level you live in and the ability people have to transport around. If you go back to medieval...
Well, yeah, of course, that's going to have a big factor. And the person's job. If they had a job where they stayed in the city all the time, then they wouldn't know the outside. But if they had a job that had them traveling a little bit, then they would know.
Yeah. So, and that's one of those things as a game master, you kind of have to just use your common sense on. Like, you don't make someone roll streetwise if they're from a large city. They would have the default skill for knowing how to get around on the streets. They might not be great at it, but they would have some knowledge just because they live there. Now, if they're in a completely separate environment, like they go from the city to a glacial sheet at the South Pole, they would have no survival skills.
Yeah, that reminds me of just the rolling aspects. Like, it gets me thinking about mechanics. You and I are kind of in the same stage of our gaming. I'm going to call it our gaming life. I was going to say our gaming career, but I'm going to call it our gaming life, in that we're so committed to story that I would just assume, just like we're playing the game that we're recording, and using the system descriptors, which literally uses no dice at all. I'm really committed to the story. I think dice are great. Like, I do love dice-based games, but I don't, at this point, have interest in playing a game that is so mechanic heavy that you get mired in the mechanics. At the same time, I think that a mechanic heavy game is important for gamers, just so that you can learn how to adapt, because there's so many games out there with different types of mechanics. I'm actually really excited because I got thinking about this. We have a show coming up in a little while. I'm not going to spoil it or get any more specific than that had me doing research. I was doing research on a couple of mechanic heavy games that, we're probably going to be talking about soon. Okay. So that got me thinking about that.
Yeah, no, one of the things I like to think about when I'm game mastering, sort of one of my house rules are, I'll work with my players, and if it makes sense for their skill, and it's like, say, a very common mundane task, like, say, in GURPS term, a difficulty of 6, and then I think that, I look at, they have a skill of 12, I might not make them roll. I probably won't make them roll. I'll give them the option if they want to, because some players want to take their own power into their hands. But if it's a mundane task, I try to avoid rolling. I'm going to eat my dinner. Roll to hit. Oh.
Yeah. I'd like to walk across the street. Dexterity check. What? I'm walking across the street. Yes.
I critically failed eating my turkey dinner. Oh, you stab yourself in the eye. You take 17
you take
points.
60 points. You've lost an eye. There's a turkey leg sticking out of your eye socket.
You're dead.
But it's like there are certainly GMs out there that will make their players go through that, and I don't want to begrudge them. The way I look at it, exactly. There's no wrong way to play it. If that's how you want to play, then great. As long as everyone's down. I'm not down for playing that way anymore, but I've certainly played games that were like that. And again, getting back to serving the story, I just assume, like, just give the player the benefit. It's just like, okay, if I let them have this. You weigh it, circumstance to circumstance. It's like, okay, he wants to do something mildly combat, but this isn't the big fight I have planned for them, so I'll let him kick the heck out of this bar room, character just to look cool. Sure, they can do that, fine. But if it's, the important fight, then no, I'm going to make him roll dice.
Mm-hmm. Or if they wanted to do something really exceptional as they're kicking the butt of the person, well, now you're going to roll. I'm sorry, you need the crit for the crit. But if it's a mundane task, I usually let it go. But once again, this game master's preference. I'm sure there are players who would hate playing with me because I don't give them complete control or give the dice the complete control over their actions. And I'm sure there's probably very few who are on either extreme, but somewhere in the middle. Now, after we go through geography and dice rolling,
Geography and text.
All right. So the next thing I'm going to look at is religions, and this could radically vary depending on where the players are from. In a lot of cultures, the religion was something you did in your everyday life. You would have a ritual for your house in the morning. It was part of your just everyday life. It wasn't like today where you think of going to church and mosques or synagogues. A lot of religions, especially earlier ones, aren't ritual specific outside of like feast. Usually in feast, in pretty much every religion I know, that's usually when you have the big religion where you're interacting with the priest. Normally, it's just your everyday household. Maybe you're doing something to purify your fields.
Bloodletting.
Yeah, usually you would like the Norse would like sort of split like they'd sacrifice a goat and they give the blood to the field. There are lots of different ways you can deal with it, and so it's the things that are important to the players would know. And once again, if there is a religion which there's probably priests somewhere, there are in most religions, that's not part of the player's guide. Now, if a player happens to be one of those priests, that's an addendum you might have to give to them. But for the most part, the players are going to know the everyday things. And that's where the skills and stuff will lead people to additional knowledge. But so there's a lot of stuff you can put there. And the other thing that they're probably going to know is going to be the pantheon or the god or the local spirits or whatever it is they are going to be worshiping.
I was about to argue what you were saying, but as you continued, I understood what you were talking about.
You understood how correct that was?
Well, sure, yes. Just that you started to talk about like the religion. They're like, oh, they wouldn't know that, but you're talking about like the higher faith of what clergy would be practicing versus what the layman farmer and his family would be doing on the daily, routine. So.
Because once again, when you're doing a player's guide, it's the general knowledge of the people of the area. So they don't know what goes on inside of the temple for the secret rituals for the religion. They do know what they do in their everyday life, what their neighbors do, what maybe their spouse does, how to sacrifice your children properly. That kind of important knowledge.
The normal stuff.
The normal stuff you would expect in any practical religion.
Right. Lovely.
And
anything you'd find in most of the religions in Jeff's world.
I know the lovely stuff.
Lots of big families because big families get smaller.
Well, and there's also interesting things too, where like in the Bedrachum, there is a newer, sort of more reformed and Iron Age kind of religion starting to set in, but the peasants don't know anything about it. There's like this building that's been built, but they don't even really go there. They think it's stupid. Usually peasants, usually farmers, they're the last to adapt to changes in religion because they're afraid to annoy the god that helps them produce their food or the spirit that helps them produce their food. They're very leery to change. That's why I believe heretic and those kind of words actually derive from ancient languages, words for people who live in the farms. A hick would be a heretic.
That's where that colloquialism comes from. I never knew that. I always wondered that.
Those were all references to people who were typically out in the fields because they were very panicky to change. But usually once they started changing, that's when a culture was really going that way. The kings go first and the farmers are the last to follow. Now, the other thing is the important observations. Most religions have like this idea of feast days or festivals that would happen in their culture that are larger community types of events. They would know those too because, even if they choose not to observe, which would be very unlikely in an ancient culture, because you wouldn't want to be the guy who causes the town to get hit by a tidal wave because you didn't go to the feast. And plus you usually got better food. So it's usually a win-win if you go. You go sacrifice to the gods and the people eat the leftovers. So
sounds like my office Christmas party. No, I wasn't gonna go to it, but my supervisor today was like, you should probably go. I'm like, and he's like, you should go. And I'm like, all right. I'm like, to be a good company man, I'll go. And he's like, you should because, and he explained a few things that I hadn't considered. And I was like, all right, fine.
Yeah. It's the political side of businesses, I guess.
Well, a little, it's a little political, and it's also, just a little background about my job. My department is my supervisor and myself. And he and I are like, I wasn't going to say that I do all the installing. I certainly don't. He absolutely works hand in hand with me for a lot of things, but there's plenty of things that, I do alone. So like certain installs will just be me. And apparently our department and the department that we work hand in hand with, our IT department, has gotten praise. I was going to say accolades, but that might be a bit too much. But basically acknowledgement for all of our efforts lately. We've had a lot of things going right lately, and they're aware of some of the really difficult obstacles that we've overcome lately, and they've been giving Pat acknowledgement for that. And he's been like, that's great, but you really have to acknowledge Michael too, and he was basically saying a bunch of great things to me about the higher ups. But these are people that I almost never see because I work in the lab or I work out in the field, so I don't see them. So he's like, you should come to the Christmas party so
they can meet you,
get more face time with these people. Oh no, I've met them all. It's not like I work in such a huge corporate environment where, like I know everybody at work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are some people that I only know their name, and that's it because they haven't worked for the company all that long.
Okay.
So sorry about the segue. That took more time than I thought it was going to.
Yeah, of course. Yep.
Shush you. Player guide.
Okay. So the next thing I like to go into is state structure. And this might not exist depending on the development. If you're in a tribal society, there is no state, but some of these items are going to exist probably. Actually, they are going to exist. But like we're talking about state structure, there's a little bit about government and how do you properly interact with your government officials. If you are a peasant, are you allowed to carry a sword around? A lot of European cultures, that would have been a no-no. You could have had one, but if you got caught with one, you'd be in big trouble.
They had no open carry policy for swords.
Well, they had no own. It was a sword-free environment unless you were a knight. So usually, that's why peasants got sick.
This is a sword-free zone.
You were within 300 feet of that school.
The school. I was going to say that. I'm sorry. The school's over there.
But outside of the general stuff for government that might or might not exist, these last three things will always exist. Views on neighbors, the cultures that surround you, or the tribes that are next to you. How do you interact with them? What are your cultural views of them? Social structure. Do you have a class system, a caste system, or something in between? I believe it's India, and they don't really know, but probably had somewhere around like 300 kinds of classes in their caste system.
300?
Yeah, because it's sort of this regional thing with occupation. Plus they have the caste system itself, but within that, they would have a breakdown based off of occupation. So it's not really, it's a lot. I don't think anyone really has an official number on the number of different classes you might occupy. But, if you are a shoemaker and you're in caste C, you are lower than a shoemaker who's in caste B or A. And if you're an untouchable caste member that makes shoes, and usually you make shoes for other people in your caste. You wouldn't make shoes for someone in a higher caste probably. So and it would be an insult for you to go to someone in a higher caste to ask them to make shoes for you. I typically don't get involved much into systems like that because they're very complicated to manage. And it doesn't make sense to my Western mind, but I kind of get how it works, but I don't think it's as simple as I'm saying either.
It's probably not. Now, I was just about to ask a cast question, so don't. Moving on.
All right. And the final thing is common types of people that you're going to run into. Are there town guards? What are their jobs? It's like one of the things, if you listen to the last episode, Mike was shocked when the castle guard's like, forget this, we're going on. But the castle guard's job is not to police the town. His job is to protect the castle from attack. That's all he cares about. He did more for that because he knew the person and Michael pressured him to do it. But in that society, that's not his job. He's not a cop. There are no cops. It goes back to sort of.
I was shocked by that.
Medieval Europe had this idea of hue and cry. And hue and cry was, if you were witness someone committing a crime, you would do a hue and cry, which would allow the other people to know that a crime was being committed. And it was the job of the peasants, the people who witnessed it, and people who heard the hue and cry to actually apprehend the person to bring him for judgment. And if you didn't and they got away, they would never get caught because there would be no investigation. Unless, of course, something bad happened to the noble. That would probably be investigated. But, normal crimes, no investigation force. It's up to you to protect your household, and you can ask for your neighbor's help. You're required to. The neighbors are required to respond if they hear you in a hue and cry society. So it depends on how your society deals with stuff. But what are the common types of people? And you don't go into the ones here that are similar. So if you were in modern day US, you wouldn't talk about this is an IT professional, this is an electrician. You would talk about things that deviate from what the players would probably know. And if they're important to the game, you might list them here. This could start some of the classes that the players might play, or as they would be called in GURPS, templates for classes. Like, these are the sorts of skills a knight would have. These are the sorts of skills that a squire would have. You could get into that kind of stuff here as well, too. That's where I would do it, actually. Now, the next thing is important people. And once again, depending on where the players are starting from, they know really important people further away, and the closer they get, the more important people there are. Now, there could be 1,000 people just like that knight who runs the fief that you live on, but that knight. You don't know all of them. You know that knight, and maybe you've met a few others. Now, food, art, architecture, music, and dress can vary a lot depending on where the culture is. Art, especially earlier on, is almost always tied back to religion. Typically, architecture is as well, too, and music. Food is what's abundant in the area, and dress are how the people in the area typically live. And so the more advanced your cultures get, the more information you can put into those areas. But in general, I try and give like Earth-like comparisons. Like, they use a Gothic style of architecture because there's so many things you can get to explain architecture that, I have textbooks over on my wall that could fill up that section. Yes. And same thing with art too. Are they into abstract art? Is it verbal poetry? Is it singing? Or, it's the themes of it, because all of those areas you could write books on. I mean, how many cookbooks are there? If you want to, make a cookbook for your culture. Yeah.
There's 5. I read them. I may have mentioned that I'm a fiction writer. And I lie.
Lying's important.
Lying is important.
Because it doesn't really turn into fiction if you don't do that. The next one that we're going to get into here are beasts. Your beastry. Once again, not bestiality, Michael.
I didn't say that.
I can still see your face. You have
no opinion of me.
Yes.
It's true, you can. I was thinking that.
But essentially, once again, if you haven't created all original creatures, you're not going to list them all here. So like in my world, I don't recreate cows and horses, those kind of things. I want to be there, but I wouldn't explain them in a bestiary. If there are exceptions that, there are no horses on this world, I would probably explain that. There are no mounted creatures. But it would typically be more things that players would hear about and be worried about that are unique. And I'd probably tell them about things that they would be worried about, even if they're from this planet. So like if you have wolves, they're going to be careful out at night hunting because they don't want to get hunted by wolves.
And if they are dire wolves, then, you want to distinguish the difference.
Yes. If they're wargs, and what the difference of those are.
Wargs. Yeah, but they're not remotely wolves, though.
Depends. Depends. Okay. Now, you could put in other mean stuff here too. Maybe you have nasty plant life that, like a Venus flytrap that eats people. Include that here too, even though they're not necessarily beasts, but things
you wouldn't include that in geography.
No. To me, things that kill you go into the beastery.
That's fair. Yeah, that will kill you.
Now, in the geography section, if there's one woods that has the Venus flytraps that eat people, that would be mentioned. But if it's sort of a common plant type across the area, which would be a really crappy place to live, but if there was, it would go there. Now, if creatures are sentient, i.e., they are considered, I don't want to say human-like intelligence because they might actually be intelligent, but they can be creative and they can make those decisions. They are alive mentally. They're a race, not a beast in my world. So that is a way I distinguish a bestiary. Like goblins and orcs in my world would not be in a bestiary. They are races. And now, the final thing is really magic rules and parameters. And so, like, if you're playing a system and you're not deviating, you're probably not going to have much here, except I would kind of go into types of colleges that are looked well upon. If there are colleges that aren't looked well upon, like, say, necromancy, you want to list that kind of stuff here. If it's a culturally specific magic, you need the whole system there. So it depends on how well you break it down. So, that's really it, unless Mike wants to go over number 12, but I'll leave that up to him.
Yeah, Jeff has an insult at the bottom of the list. We're not going to go over it.
You always deviate from the bullet points anyway, so why should we?
It's just an insult on me, Jeff.
Yeah, but that's really it for me in a player guide. The thing is to keep in mind is, once again, when you're creating a player guide, what should the average person know? And there are, yes, going to be people who might know less, and there are people who might know more, but those are exceptions you have to deal with. A player's guide, think of it as like, your travel guide to Italy. It's going to give you descriptions of points of interest and things that you need to know when you visit Italy. I advise to buy them, and if you don't want to go to Italy, send them to me. So now for the World Builder's Task of the Day. Michael, can you come up with a World Building Task of the Day?
Yeah, absolutely. I got a World Builder's Task. Create your player's guides for the GMs out there, and I'll do two. I'll do one for the GMs out there, and then one for those of you that have no idea what I'm talking about. And on the Facebook page, I wanted to say to everybody, the group, guys, thanks so much. Everyone's getting really active on Facebook, and if you haven't joined us on the Facebook page, then do it, because there's a lot of great content being shared up there, and a lot of nice people that are talking about their projects and sharing, crowdsourcing each other, which is cool. That's exactly the type of thing that we wanted to build. So on the Facebook page, somebody had asked me, what does this mean and what does that mean? Because we do use a lot of role-playing acronyms. So I'll get more specific. So GM, Game Master, DM, Dungeon Master. This is the guy running the game if you're playing a tabletop role-playing game. For your DMs, make your player guides. And this is obviously a primer for doing that. That's what this episode was. But I'm also not opposed if you're going to do like a one-shot. If you're working with a familiar world, or you don't necessarily need to get into stuff super specific to run the story that you're going to tell that night, you could just tell people the really basic stuff they need to know, and then fill them in as you go, because it's not going to matter a whole heck of a lot. But
I just think a lot with that, you have to be lenient upon them and step in when they start to sit in the seat.
Definitely.
Before it explodes, you're like, wait, you wouldn't do that because that seat's going to explode. And then a player like Mike would be like, and sit down and blow up anyway. So
what I was going to say though is for gardeners and architects, definitely, Jeff, being a hardcore architect, you're definitely going to want to do these character guides, build something together so that your players know what's going on. For those of you that are just the writers and the world builders out there, I would say that your World Builder Guide, World Builder Task from this episode is going to be kind of the opposite. Take the things that you would put in a World Builder's Guide if you're going to build a world for a game, and don't bore your readers with that being the first few chapters of the book. I mean, if you're just talking about this plant and this walkway and the mason who built that walkway and his culture and all that stuff, it's filler. Like, it's great detail. I'm not belittling the detail. Knowing all those things and creating all those things is important to flesh out a world and make it believable. But that doesn't mean you have to tell all of that stuff. You know, I can walk out my front door and see quadrillions of details that I ignore every morning because none of it's interesting.
Yeah. And I think the thing to keep in there too is it's also great. You know, people always talk about, you know, as a writer, you should share behind the scenes stuff. It's not just like, you know, pictures of you and your spouse at dinner, or the plate of food you eat every night, or the cup of coffee every afternoon. You know, give behind the scenes of your world. You know, give some more detail that they're not going to get from the book because you work hard on it. It's a great thing that you can share out. You know, maybe to be careful with the timing. That's why mine's going to be behind it'll be free, but it's going to be behind a closed login. That way people will only get to it if they want to. But, you know, if they want to, they'll be able to go there and learn more about my world, whether it's because they want to read my books or whether it's because they want to use my world to play with, or hopefully when I get more time and start running games somewhere like on Roll20, I'll actually use those and say, hey, go here.
You have to read this.
Get this, and this will let you know where we're starting.
For the real world task of the day, do you have one, or do you need me to generate something?
I'm going to give one here.
Okay.
And this is going to be preparation for next year. One of my goals next year is every month, and actually I've already started this month, but every month have one thing that you learn something about, you get more detail about. And you're not going to get a huge in-depth learning of it, but spend a month, you know, whether it's photography or drawing, or like this month, I'm actually in great courses. I'm learning how to do hieroglyphics. Not demonic, but hieroglyphics. No, there's a written version, a cursive version that was used by the people, and hieroglyphics were the holy glyphs of Egypt. So it's the same language, but they're slightly different forms, and probably easier to draw if you learn the other one. But I'm learning that this month. I don't know how much of it I'll know or retain, but it'll help me understand different languages as a world builder, and hopefully I can make better languages because of it too. But it's just something I want to do. Maybe it's you want to learn about Spanish. There's some country you've always wanted to visit. You know, spend a month learning everything you can about it. You know, so if you ever make it, you can actually do the things you want to while you're there. Or you might go, wait, this place is really lame.
And done. I actually really like this idea. I think this is really cool. I might have to jump on the bandwagon. Yep. Jeff, you had a good idea.
Thank you so much for listening to the World Builders Anvil. We would love it if you would share the World Builders Anvil with 2 of your friends, and so would they. If they are unfamiliar with podcasts, then you get to introduce them to the wonderful world of podcasting by showing them Stitcher or iTunes, or, best of all, just send them to our website, www.gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com.
Now strike while the mithril's hot.